Welcome, everybody. Welcome to the Future Trends Forum. I'm delighted to see you all here, and I'm looking forward to today's conversation. My name is Brian Alexander. I'm the forum's host, creator, and chief cat herder for the next hour, and I'm really looking forward to our conversation. So, Tara, over to the next slide, please. To begin, let me introduce the forum. Let me explain where it comes from and how it works, and who supports it, and how the technology functions, and then we'll begin by introducing our guest. So the first thing is, the forum is a discussion-based platform. Our idea here is to focus on conversation between the guest and all of us. So we don't really believe in presentation. And the slides we have here are only going to be up for a couple minutes. This spins out of a long-running project called the Future Trends in Technology and Education Report, FTTE for short. And that's a monthly trends analysis that looks at major trends that reshape education and technology. Tracks about 85 or 86 of them. This has been going on for about 6 years. It comes out every month as a PDF. You can find out more, download, or subscribe at ftte.us. And of course, you can follow conversations using the hashtag FTTE. Next slide, please. Now, the FTTE report and this discussion forum are part of a broader project called the Future of Education Observatory. And if you go to futureofeducation.us, you can learn more. This is a multimedia, participatory, ongoing, and open attempt to try to grapple with the future of education and technology. We use every tool at our disposal, which is why we have a blog, we have an online book club, we have this forum, we have as well the FTTE report, we have more to come. So if you're curious about how this works, this unique project, go to futureofeducation.us and find out more. Next slide, please. Now, we can only do this work with the help of sponsors and supporters. So I want to thank them before we go further. First, I'd like to thank NYSERNet from New York State. That nonprofit helps get that colleges, universities, and colleges on broadband internet. They do terrific work in New York, and we're very grateful to them for their generous sponsorship. We're also thankful to Shindig, because as you can tell, they make available the technology we're using now. But speaking of which, if you haven't used it before, if you've used it lately, let me just walk you through it so you can see where things are. First of all, where I am and where the slide is just for a minute is called the stage. Everything that goes on here can be seen and heard by everybody participating in this video conference. And you can join us on stage, and I'll show you how. Now, just below us, you can see a bunch of different icons of people. You can see Thomas Doonan. You can see the outline of Dana Kalsa. All of those people represent one person or a sign-in from one location. You can mouse over them to get a little bit more information. And if you'd like to have a private chat with one, just double-click on them. And if they feel like talking to you and their technology is working, your two icons will click together like Legos. You can have a brief audio-visual bubble, which is pretty nice. But otherwise, if you want to speak to the rest of us for a whole conversation, let me show you 3 different tools for doing so. Look at the very bottom of the screen. There's a white strip running along it. There's a bunch of different icons. On the far left area are 3. So the first one I want you to see is what looks like a number with a bunch of human outlines and a kind of dialog box. If you click that, up will pop 2 different windows. The window on the left that comes up is a kind of film strip view that shows you where a little bit of every person who's here. So you can mouse over, say, Heather Marger and learn that she's at Chemetka Community College and probably regretting me mispronouncing her name out loud. You can see other people as well, including today's guest, Jarret Cummings. You can see stalwart Vanessa Vale, always a great friend of the program. So that gives you a quick sense of who's here. On the right of that is a chat box, and you can chat with roughly the 18 or 19 or so people who've signed in around the same time you have. And that's a good way to have an informal conversation going. I find people often like to say hello, socialize a bit, but also like to share links and other resources that come up online during our discussion. So there's the chat box. Now, back to that white strip. There are 2 more powerful tools. Next to the chat box icon is a question mark with a circle around it. If you click that, up will pop a little box where you can type in a question you'd like to ask. So type in there if you want us to ask it, and I will read it out loud so everyone can hear it, and we'll flash it on the screen so everyone can see it. Now, more powerful than that is the raised hand icon. If you click that, that tells us you want to join us up here on stage. So, if your microphone is working and your camera is working, and you're in a spot where you can talk out loud, like in an office or anywhere, then click that button, and it'll tell us you can want to join us. And when the time is right, we'll beam you on stage, and you can be here with me and with our next guest and perhaps another person as well. It's really easy to do. I'll show you how this works, and you'll see people joining us during the next hour. So, Those are three great methods for interacting with all of us. Again, this is an interactive discussion. Please use all those methods. Now, if you'd like to learn more about the Future Trends Forum or about the guests' work, take a look on the left edge of the screen. You'll see a few widgets which have different links. One of them is supporting the Future Trends Forum Patreon, which I'll explain in a minute. Another one is EDUCAUSE during the net neutrality amicus brief. So you can click on those, and they'll pop up a new window which has more information or links to those. So, all these different ways to interact. Please take advantage of the ones that work for you and feel comfortable. And my thanks to Shindig for giving us access to this great technology. Now, besides Shindig and NiserNet, I'd also like to thank our supporters on Patreon. So if you haven't seen it before, Patreon is a crowdfunding site, kind of like Kickstarter or GoFundMe, where you support someone who's making stuff. In this case, the stuff is the future of education media. So if you go to patreon.com/Brian Alexander, you can find almost 100 people who've signed up to contribute as little as $1 a month to keep the lights on. And people who contribute more than that, they get all kinds of free benefits. They get private blog posts from me, they get conversations at video conferences. And you can see here, just by looking at the screen, that we have wonderful people who have signed up to contribute, and we're grateful to them. Folks like Jimmy Q. Hahn, Bob Johnson, Kyle Johnson, Chris Lott, all kinds of wonderful people. So we're grateful to them for their support, and we hope you can join them. Now, that's who supports the forum. That's how the technology works. That's where it came from. Now let me introduce you to this week's guest. I'm really, really delighted to have Jarret Cummings back. Jarret is a previous guest. He was here almost about half a year ago, where he talked about net neutrality. Who is Jarret? Why does he talk about net neutrality? Because he's the Director of Policy and Government Relations at EDUCAUSE. It's his job to pay attention to, be on top of, and advocate for educators in the whole world of technology and policy. He's an expert on this subject, a very, very kind guest last time who answered all of our questions very, very generously. We're really grateful he can make some time to talk about what's happening with net neutrality. So let's dispense with this slide, bring Jarret back up on stage, and we can continue our conversation. And just as a heads up, we're going to be talking about topics that are in two different domains that can be very complicated. We're going to be talking about technology, and we're also going to be talking about government policy, multiple governments and their policies. So if at any point you feel confused, you don't understand what a term is or a reference, if we leap to a legal case or we mention a specific back-end technology and you don't feel comfortable with it, please ask at any point. I want to make sure that everybody feels comfortable participating. So welcome, Jarret.
Hi, Brian. Thanks for having me.
Oh, my pleasure. It's great to see you back. Where are you today?
Wet, chilly Rockville, Maryland, just outside of Washington, D.C. 2 stops from the end of the, one stop from the end of the red line on my branch. So, for those who are familiar with the metro system.
Well, welcome. I'm glad you're here, and I hope you stay dry.
Fortunately, the weather never changes inside my home office, so
that's what you want.
Yeah, we have had an occasional air conditioning problem, but so far so good.
Well, tell us, I quickly introduced you, but why don't you introduce yourself, everybody? What do you do for EDUCAUSE? What do you work on?
Sure. Well, just to level set for everyone, EDUCAUSE is the Association for Higher Education IT Leaders and Professionals, as well as members of the higher education community who are interested in the role of technology in higher education. I serve as we had a recent title change, but not one that's terribly dramatic. So my title is now Senior Advisor for Policy and Government Relations. And in that role, I'm responsible for identifying and tracking policy issues that may impact the role of IT in higher education, coordinating the activities of the consultants that support us in that effort, and building and managing our relationships with other organizations that help us to respond effectively to those issues. And the issue spaces in general, well, we try to catch everything that comes over the wall that might impact how IT is used to support the mission of higher education. But in particular, we find that most of our issues coalesce around information security and data privacy, networking and telecommunications, which is where net neutrality comes into play, e-learning, and then we still do have to pay attention to Digital Millennium Copyright Act issues. So it's I said we have four primary areas, but it's really like 3A.
I understand. That's a lot to cover. It's quite a brief, and we're grateful to you for doing that work.
No, thank you.
Well, to begin with, friends, we've been talking about net neutrality ever since this became an issue. And last year, the FCC decided to basically end net neutrality as a federal government policy. So, I have a few questions I'd like to begin with. But please, you will have questions as you come up. The questions may involve either the general world of policy and how this is changing, or they may involve practical things for your own institution. So if you have questions of, I'm a librarian, I'm a technologist, I'm a provost, what can I do? Have all those questions ready to go. So I'd like to begin with right now. If you can just give us a quick lay of the land. Ajit Pai ended net neutrality. What's been happening since? Where do things stand? I mean, is this the post-net neutral world right now?
Well, not quite. The lawsuits were ready to go. In fact, the legal challenges had already been somewhat preemptively filed even before the FCC made its ruling. So, in essence, we had the spectacle of as soon as the FCC made its ruling, the petitioners all had to pull down their pre-existing legal challenges and refile essentially the same things. Now that the FCC had taken action, those cases against what was known to be the coming FCC action could move forward. Most of this year has been just waiting for the legal process to get underway. So it wasn't until August that the petitioners, those who were challenging the FCC's 2017 order, had to file their briefs with the court stating their case. Then those of us who were interested in filing amicus briefs in support of their position, we filed a week later. So our brief was filed towards the end of August. Now we're waiting for the FCC and its supporting organizations to file their respondents' briefs. And those are due roughly mid-October. Then there's going to be another period where either side can file reply briefs. So, the usual sniping back and forth over what we see in each other's briefs. And then finally, that will wrap up the assemblage of the various arguments at the end of November. The court will largely at that point try to absorb that content heading into oral arguments starting on February 1st. And then once oral arguments are over, it's expected it'll take the DC Circuit probably until late spring, maybe early to midsummer to finally issue its ruling.
Late spring or summer?
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, late spring or summer.
Yeah, and that's not the end at that juncture either, because it's almost guaranteed that whoever loses the case in front of the DC Circuit will either then ask to appeal to the full DC Circuit. So the case will initially be heard by a 3-judge panel of the DC Circuit. Whoever loses has the right to appeal to the full DC Circuit. So all of the judges on the circuit would then hear the case. And then from there, the question would simply be whether if the full DC Circuit reverses the original panel, then whoever loses at that point may appeal to the Supreme Court. Or you could see whoever loses on the initial 3-judge panel ruling attempt to appeal to the full Supreme Court on the grounds that this is just too significant of a national issue not to be resolved at that level straight away.
Wow. So we're looking at almost a year just for the first phase of this lawsuit to go through.
Absolutely. And that's assuming everything goes well. And in the meantime, there's this process typically has just always been characterized by various starts and stops based on what the court action is versus what the FCC is trying to do in terms of its regulatory activity. even if, for example, the DC Circuit rules against the current order, it may not rule against all aspects of the current order, or it may issue, or it may issue a ruling that is not definitive in terms of restoring the 2015 rules, which is what those of us on the petitioner's side would like to see. So in that situation, you could find that even after a series of appeals, if the ruling of the court doesn't vacate the 2017 order directly or specifically restore the 2015 rules, you could still have a situation where the current FCC might then try to issue a new order that would allow it to go as far in impinging on network neutrality as it thinks the current court ruling will allow it. And then we start all over again.
Wow, this could go for years.
It's been going for years. This current process is just the latest iteration. Even with the 2015 rules, the telecom industry filed a court case that was actually technically still in front of the DC Circuit now. The appeal of the 2015 ruling to the DC Circuit, of the 2015 order to the DC Circuit, the initial court ruling upheld the FCC's 2015 rules. So the telecommunications associations were appealing that ruling into 2016 when we had the change in administration, the change in leadership at the FCC. And so, in some sense, it's all been one long continuation of the same process.
This is like the, what's the Dickens lawsuit in Bleak House? Jardice versus Jardice, the one that goes on for generations.
Oh, okay. I'm not familiar with it, but it sounds like an appropriate reference.
Well, we have a question from one of the people in the chat box. I think this is Steve Terry. He has a quick question, which is very smart. Based on previous trends of the DC Circuit, is the court leaning towards upholding or ending net neutrality?
There really is no way to know. We originally, the DC Circuit's been on both sides of this issue based upon the arguments that were presented at the time. So we got to the 2015 FCC order because the 2010 FCC order had been overturned by the DC Circuit. And that had been allowed to stand for a period of time while the FCC then tried to develop network neutrality rules that would withstand the court's scrutiny based upon the parameters that were presented. So much depends on which judges are impaneled. I don't believe it's even been announced yet which 3 judges from the DC Circuit will hear the current appeal. And, for example, in the current, it's something of a footnote in the current Supreme Court nominating fight because of the other rather overwhelming issues involved. But Judge Kavanaugh's rulings on network neutrality at the DC Circuit are not particularly heartwarming for those of us who support network neutrality. So that was initially thought perhaps to be one of the issues that might come into play as the Senate Judiciary Committee conducted his nomination hearing. Obviously, that's since been swamped by even bigger concerns, but still, that's if someone else had been appointed or nominated to serve on the Supreme Court and Kavanaugh was available to be appointed to that 3-judge panel, that could significantly influence how the court rules.
Okay, that's good looking ahead, which is what we do here on the forum. Let me just remind everybody that this is dense stuff with a lot of different pieces to it, so please ask more questions. I have a whole stack, but we'd rather hear from you. So again, just look in the bottom of the screen, use that white strip, and click the question mark if you have a text question you want to type in, or click the raised hand if you want to join Jarret and I here on stage. Let me that's one major lawsuit. Does the suit have a name that we can refer to it, or is it just the big lawsuit?
Actually, if you click on the amicus brief link, the first page of our amicus brief lists the name of the case as far as the DC Circuit is concerned. Okay. So it's Mozilla et al. But at this point, it would be basically, I think the easiest shorthand is just the legal challenge to the 2017 repeal.
That works. Thank you. But this is one part of policy, one part of government. And we're talking about the federal judiciary. What about the federal legislature? Do you see any action coming from Congress? And don't laugh out loud at the very question.
Well, it's always a double-edged sword for higher education for a lot of other groups, because the Congress acting may not always be what you're looking for. So there's calling for congressional action can be a dicey proposition almost no matter what you do. But I would say that the chances of congressional action prior to the DC Circuit's ruling sometime next year is very limited. With the midterm elections coming up, and of course now the Supreme Court nominating fight and the struggle to get the minibus appropriations bills through Congress and signed by the president without addressing his wall funding. There's just no space. Plus, with the possibility of at least one chamber of Congress changing hands, there's very little incentive for the parties to come together ahead of the midterms. Now, what would be helpful is for Congress, after the midterms are settled, once the new Congress is seated in 2019, hopefully we will have a better sense of where the balance of power will be on this issue, and Congress will be in a position to move forward. In the absence of congressional action to resolve this issue, we're probably going to continue to see this ping-ponging in the courts as long as the possibility of the FCC's leadership changing hands. We've now seen with Ajit Pai's action, the precedent established that the next chairman, if it's a Democratic chairman, may come in and try to use the regulatory and bureaucratic mechanisms available to him to change course once again. Now, that could be affected by how the DC Circuit rules on Pai's current action. A lot of what the FCC did in this case hinges on the particular deference that the court grants to federal regulatory agencies in areas of their expertise. It's based upon a particular case. It's commonly referred to as Chevron deference, after the Chevron oil company. So if there's a possibility that if the court rules against the current FCC, while that might be positive for network neutrality, it may undermine the deference that a future FCC or federal agencies in general have in terms of interpreting law and establishing regulation. So that could complicate some of this ping-ponging in the future. Excuse me, we'll just have to see.
Well, I'd like to complicate it a bit further, but Thomas Doonan has a question. Let's flash this on the screen. So Thomas asks, what can we as American citizens do to help support the fight for net neutrality? Great question, Tom.
Well, and if I recall correctly, Thomas is in Ventura, California, where really the next phase of this debate, while the DC Circuit is going through its machinations, the next phase is really around state action. And California is possibly, at the end of this month, going to take the single biggest action to restore some broad measure of network neutrality that we've seen thus far. Right now, Governor Brown has before him legislation that's cleared the Assembly and the Senate in the state of California that would not only adopt the 2015 network neutrality rules within the state of California, but would go a step further and ban a particular form of paid prioritization that's highly problematic. So Washington State was the first state to pass a law that applied the 2015 rules within its jurisdiction. The California potential law, takes that and then goes one step further in building on network neutrality protections. And it's also the model for a bill that's before the New York State Assembly, which would do the same thing. So if Governor Brown signs the measure into law, that obviously, with California accounting for about 10% of the U.S. population, it's a huge market. It gives it the potential to have some significant influence, much the same way as it has in car emission standards. But then if New York follows suit and goes beyond Governor Cuomo's executive order and passes essentially the same provisions into law in New York State, now you're talking about 20% of the U.S. population being covered by legislation that restores actual network neutrality protections. That's going to be extremely hard for the ISPs to ignore. The only question is going to be how quickly the telecoms will file suit in California seeking to overturn the California law. And then likewise, if New York moves forward, what the timetable for that is, and then what will be the timetable for legal challenges to its law as well.
Oh, this is fascinating. And this is going to cut in a few different directions. Thomas, thank you for the question. Let me just unpack this in a few different levels. So one is what we're seeing in addition to the federal legal challenge, in addition to the possibility but a little likelihood of congressional action, we're seeing individual states taking steps. And they're doing this either through legislation or through executive order. Now, I have to ask, first of all, what's the federalist question here? I mean, will the states run into problems of the FCC being federal, being let all the land, overruling them? Or is this a case where the states can legally carve out their own local rulings?
Well, that's really where the legal challenges are going to the various state actions are going to come together. And it's important first to distinguish between the two types of positions that states are taking. Because in the case of Washington and California and possibly ultimately New York, if they pass similar legislation, those are laws that would have the state directly regulating ISP behavior within the state. And there is a provision in the 2017 repeal order from the FCC that attempts to assert federal preemption, the right for federal law and regulation to supersede state law and regulation in areas that fall under federal responsibility. And so that's one set of challenges. The other set of state challenges are the executive orders in New York, New Jersey, Montana, as well as the laws that were passed in Vermont and Oregon, where they don't try to regulate ISPs directly, but rather they set in place state procurement criteria. So they try to use the buying power of the state to influence the restoration of network neutrality protections. So with the first set, there's some thinking that the FCC may have been too cute by half in its 2017 repeal order because it went further than any previous challenge to the FCC's authority in this space by essentially saying Congress never gave us the authority as the FCC to regulate broadband internet access services. And so therefore, that's why we're getting out of this business and we're handing it all over to the Federal Trade Commission, except for transparency requirements and federal preemption. And there's some thinking among various legal experts that in vacating its authority to act in the broadband space, it also eliminated, the FCC also eliminated its ability to preempt state action in this space. So that's going to be one of the issues that gets worked out in court.
That's tricky.
Yeah, and there are other aspects to it that are interesting because even if Congress has not specifically acted in an area of interstate commerce, there's something called the Dormant Commerce Clause. Sorry, I'm having trouble saying it. That, yeah. I'm also, I usually have big problems with itinerary as well. I've really had to learn to focus on that.
That's a hard word in English. You're fine with that.
Thank you. I appreciate it. So with the Dormant Commerce Clause, even in areas where Congress has not asserted its constitutional authority over interstate commerce, courts have ruled that states may not pass laws and regulations that unduly burden interstate commerce. So with that first set, Washington, California, if it passes, New York, if it passes, the challenges are probably going to be fought out over whether their network neutrality protections are vacated based upon the Dormant Commerce Clause or not.
Wow.
With the other set of state actions, where you're talking about the states using their purchasing authority to say, we're not going to buy telecommunication services from companies that don't incorporate network neutrality rules into their business practices. That is a much safer space from a legal challenge perspective because it's not direct regulation of ISPs at all. It's just a state like California with its hundreds of millions of dollars in procurement buying power saying, we're not going to do business with people who don't do business the way we want to do business. So that's positive from the standpoint of having those actions subject to legal challenge. The downside, of course, is if the ISPs say, fine, we don't want your business, it sets up an interesting problem for the state because the state can't get by without broadband internet services. So you get into a sort of a game of chicken in that situation. In either case, it just adds to this swirl of legal and regulatory issues that really won't be fully resolved until Congress is able to come together around some sort of national legislation to move beyond the Communications Act of the 30s and the Telecommunications Act of the mid-90s and put something in place that matches where we are today.
So you might be looking as far ahead as 2021 for that. Friends, I'm very grateful to Jarret for walking us through this complicated swirl because there are a lot of moving parts, some slow moving. This is a very, very challenging topic. And I want to come back to Thomas's question and to Jarret's great answer. And I'd like to break us into groups to think about this. What I'd like to ask you to do first is I'd like you to think about where you are seeing net neutrality impacting you. So that is, have you experienced ISP slowdowns or other issues? Is the institution or any institutions that you may work with, have they had policies or have they changed anything as a result? If you're an American in a given American state, has your state taken any steps or is your state considering anything like this? So what I'd like to ask is for you to break into groups. This is called a mingle session on the forum. And the groups can be as small as 2 people or as large as 4. And the way to do this is, first of all, turn on your camera if you haven't already. That's a good way that people actually see you and say hello. And then just double click on somebody who sounds interesting. And I'd like you to think about this. Where is net neutrality hitting you personally and professionally? And then in about 5 minutes, we'll come back and report back. So does that make sense? Will that work for everybody? It should. This works before. The technology is great. Let's go into that charge. So take 5 minutes and think about how this is impacting you. And Jarret and I can flit around and join individual groups as you chat. Let's go mingle. Well, welcome back. Welcome back. It's always fun to break into groups and have more individual one-on-one or one-on-two conversations. I'm really glad to hear that. And welcome back, Jarret.
Howdy.
So let me ask, did you get to talk to anybody? And what did you find out from people's individual interest and take on net neutrality?
Yeah, well, I did talk with one of the CIOs participating, and we discussed whether or not, the question you asked, whether or not people are seeing direct effects from ISP's freedom in relation to net neutrality. And he made the point that it's hard to tell at this juncture. It's hard to distinguish between normal service problems that you might have at home, and
Right.
whether or not Comcast or Verizon or whoever you have is actually trying to tweak the availability of content into your home or over your cell phone.
That's
but I think
interesting.
that's from my perspective, I think that it was Kelly. There we go. Kelly Walsh, CIO of the College of Westchester. Did I get that right?
Yeah. Kelly's a great guy.
Sorry, I had to move my cursor around until I hit the right picture. But I think that at this point in time, the ISPs are largely laying low in terms of exploring the limits of their newfound freedom, because with the case before the DC Circuit, they don't want to hand the petitioners another club to use against their support of the FCC in this case. And to a certain extent, some of that's likely to extend even if the DC Circuit upholds the 2017 ruling, because looking ahead to 2020, the ISPs know that there could very well be a Democratic administration, thus a Democratic FCC in 2020, which could take this in a significantly different direction, especially if the court upholds the 2017 order, because that means they've upheld the FCC's ability to make those kinds of radical changes in a short period of time. And so if you know that this ultimately has to get solved in Congress with some sort of compromise, the extent to which you are willing to generate potential political backlash by trying to take advantage in the short term of a loss of network neutrality, I think may be somewhat limited. To a certain extent, we'll just have to see what happens once the DC Circuit's ruled. But as we talked about, if that ruling is inevitably appealed and then ultimately goes up to the Supreme Court, that could just extend the legal handcuffs they're keeping the ISPs from simply doing whatever they want.
No, that makes sense. I was thinking of what you said earlier about the hard to tell the difference between ISPs throttling signal and all the other issues. I mentioned in my small group, the state of Vermont websites went offline for about 12 hours last month. And could this be it? Could Comcast have really acted? It turned out that a squirrel had chewed through a crucial cable and taken them offline. It's a low-tech state of Vermont. Friends, let me ask, what came up in your conversations? What aspects of net neutrality in your life, again, either in your personal life or your professional life, did you encounter? What surfaced up? So either hit the, you can click the raised hand icon if your camera is on and you'd like to join us, or if you want, just over here, just to the other side of Jarret, you can see a podium button. If you just click that button, it says join podium, up you go, you're right on stage. Or if your mic isn't working, your camera's not working, just click the ask button and throw out a question or comment. Again, this is really, really important stuff. This is, in a sense, a kind of research that we're doing, trying to figure out how net neutrality actually impacts daily life. While you're thinking about that, I'll mention one person I spoke with said that it was something similar. That it wasn't net neutrality wasn't a major issue where she was. The most interested people tended to be younger, people who are already engaged with technology. But overall, it seems to be still kind of a dormant issue right now. So,
well, that's the unique aspect of this entire issue is that we've not really, prior to the 2017 order, lived in a world where there wasn't some FCC oversight of broadband access in relation to network neutrality. And so the really radical part of what the 2017 order did was not just change policy, I'm somewhat paraphrasing from Harold Feld at Public Knowledge here, but it didn't just change the FCC's policy; it fundamentally rejected the FCC as having any authority to impose significant regulation on broadband at all. And so, what's at stake with the court ruling, as well as the various state actions to restore some measure of network neutrality within their jurisdictions, is that if the 2017 order is ultimately upheld, now we're completely reliant, absent state action, absent the states maintaining their ability to regulate in their spaces, we're completely reliant on the Federal Trade Commission and after the fact legal compliance to provide some measure of network neutrality. And that's a very clunky mechanism to try to address something that's potentially very fast moving in the internet space. I mean, antitrust cases can take years, sometimes a decade or more. The consumer protection element of the FTC's authority is completely dependent upon whether or not the company is upholding the terms and conditions it has presented to consumers. And so, the FCC would say, well, our transparency requirement, the one thing we think we can still legitimately do, because we've said we don't have any authority other than to do this, we think the transparency requirement will feed into that, because if an ISP has to tell everyone what it's doing, then that will provide the basis for the FTC to police on the consumer protection side. However, there are ways, and then there are ways, as we know, to phrase how ISPs are presenting their terms and conditions. So to think that transparency alone is really going to support FTC enforcement, or that transparency is really going to drive consumers to choose different internet service providers if they don't like the one they have, when the FCC's own data shows that most people really don't have any choice in broadband provider. It just I mean, I'm biased. I admit up front I'm biased, but the arguments themselves, just from a purely objective and logical standpoint, are just deeply flawed.
I'll give you one little story, and then we have a text question that's come up. The story is Ajit Pai actually came to my state a couple of weeks ago for a visit, and the high point, I think, for me was him trying to make a cell phone call, and he couldn't get good signal, so he had to go into somebody's house to use a landline. We have a true story. We have a question from Rosalind. Tara, why don't you flash that on the screen, please? This is from Rosalind Gentry, which is, it came up that the have and the have-nots gap will widen. I'm around people who are in low-income areas and already have seen the lessened access to the internet poses a great problem. It's a great point about the digital divide, Rosalind. Absolutely. Jarret, where do you think? How is the end of neutrality going to impact the digital divide?
Well, again, when we start talking about what I personally perceive as the logical fallacies in the current FCC majority's arguments, their entire premise for eliminating network neutrality protections is that those network neutrality protections somehow inhibit ISP investment, because they create regulatory uncertainty, and therefore ISPs are less willing to invest in the growth and development of their networks, and thus they're less willing to invest in rural and underserved areas because of network neutrality. That's the 2017 order is littered with that perspective, and it just, again, in my view, belies all objective reality, because the bottom line is that companies invest where they can make money. And the reason why they haven't invested in rural areas and underserved areas is because those are very expensive places to serve, and there's not enough population density to allow them to recoup their costs and make whatever profit they feel is justifies that expense. And this is we've seen throughout American history with the investment in the railroads and then in the telephone system and on and on and on. Electrification. Even further than that, postal service. I mean, just going back to the history of the postal service, it's all based on the understanding that it is in the national interest for all communities, regardless of their population density or their relative income, to have access to these basic fundamental services. So ultimately, if we as a nation believe that is the case about broadband internet access service, that it is a foundational service for our modern society and economy, which I think is fairly well established at this point,
yes,
then we're going to have to be willing to make a national investment in ensuring that all of America is able to get online and get online at a speed that really supports contemporary internet services as well as the future. So, this idea that we can, if we eliminate network neutrality protections, which have the argument that supported the 2015, the argument that the FCC made in trying to save the 2010 order, which ultimately provided the foundation for the 2015 rules, was this concept of the virtuous circle. And the court that overturned the 2010 order upheld that concept. They said, basically, the 2010 order, you didn't use the correct legal basis to try to establish your network neutrality requirements. However, the court was very much persuaded by the FCC's argument that it is openness that fosters innovation, which fosters consumer demand, which in turn supports greater network build out. And so we have evidence for that. The evidence that the current majority on the FCC tried to present to justify its assertion that network neutrality rules inhibit ISP investment in their networks, there's very good reason to think that that is flawed. In fact, what's interesting is they repeatedly tried to cite increased network investment by ISPs since the 2017 order emerged as supporting their position. But if you look at when those investments were committed, they were almost all committed while the original network neutrality rules were in effect. So it is cherry picking at its finest. I think that the petitioners have presented a very good basis for questioning the evidence that the current majority has presented to justify its case. The question is simply going to come down to whether or not the court will see the other aspects of the FCC's argument that it has the authority to do it, regardless of these other considerations, whether the court will uphold that perspective.
Let me, okay, first of all, Rosalind, thank you for asking a question which is dear to my heart, dear to the concerns of the Future Trends Forum community, and you can tell one that Jarret is deeply invested in and knowledgeable about. Thank you, Jarret, for the sustained answer to this deep question. I have one last question to bring up, which is about a month ago in California, we had the huge fire, Mendocino complex fire. And at one point, Verizon throttled the wireless signal to a team of first responders, including firefighters. Is that an example of the kind of ISP throttling that we should expect, or is that an unrelated case?
Well, it's related, although it's questionable as to whether or not that is strictly speaking an instance of violating network neutrality. I think there's a case to be made that it is, and in fact, in the comment that I provided, in fact, let me do this right now, just in case people haven't seen the comment that I added to your blog post earlier. This blog post, again from Harold Feld at Public Knowledge, does an exceptional job of explaining how network neutrality rules would have prevented that event from happening. So there's, as he argues, there's reason to debate. The FCC has defenses for saying that the actual activity that took place, or Verizon, I'm sorry, Verizon has they have relevant defenses for the activity that took place. But that said, Feld really explains, I think, in tremendous detail, how the loss of network neutrality rules prevented the FCC from taking what would have been a normal action that could have precluded something like that from ever happening in the first place.
That's a huge, huge gap. All right. Let me ask one last question on behalf of everybody, and go back to what Thomas asked at the beginning of the hour, which is, you've got 1 minute to answer this, by the way. What practical steps can people take to try to bring net neutrality back? By people, I mean faculty, staff, students, administrators, citizens, residents.
Well, network neutrality legislation has thus far been presented in over 30 states. So there's a significant upswell in state interest in trying to address this issue. And so while the federal case is ongoing and Congress is bogged down with the midterms and waiting to see who's going to be in charge and what the court is going to do, your state legislature may be considering state level protections, and it's worthwhile to look for those and see if you can get behind them. If you look at the National Conference of State Legislatures site that we highlighted in the materials, you'll see that many of the bills that were submitted in the recent legislative sessions didn't pass. But just because they didn't pass in this session doesn't mean they can't be reintroduced and possibly be successful in the next one. So that provides a nice list for you to look and see, has my state considered something like this, or are they considering something like this? And if so, you'll be able to see which legislator is trying to do something in this space. Get in touch with his office, see what his or her plans are, for continuing to move that legislation forward.
Good. So turn to the states. That's great advice, and very, very practical. Well, let me ask you one last question, Jarret. How do I keep up with you? How does everyone follow your wonderful work in researching this, keeping up with it, and explaining it in calm, patient English? What's the best way to track you?
Thank you. I appreciate that. I almost always address issues through the EDUCAUSE Policy Spotlight on the EDUCAUSE Review website. So if you just search for EDUCAUSE Policy Spotlight, you'll inevitably find us, and that's where our information really goes up first.
Excellent. How can we track you if we want to find out more about what Jarret Cummings is up to?
Well, that's where if there are posts on the EDUCAUSE Policy Spotlight, it's either me or Katie Branson, who is one of our outside consultants who primarily supports me. So it's one of the two of us, and that's usually the place that you'll find me.
Excellent. Well, once again, on behalf of the entire community, thank you, and thanks to Katie Branson for your very, very important work on this. Everybody else, get back to your states. Make sure they do the right thing. And Jarret will follow up probably next year and see where things are going.
Thanks, Brian. Thanks again for having me.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Friends, I need to tell you about next week and where the forum is headed next. But let me again thank you for working through a very, very challenging, somewhat dormant, yet vitally important topic. Now, next week, we switch gears, and we'll be talking with Anant Agarwal, who is the founder and CEO of EDX, one of the world's most important MOOC platforms. He's also a professor at MIT. And we're going to be asking him, where are MOOCs going? We've had the huge hype boom of them in 2012, a hype crash, yet MOOCs keep coming. What's happening with them next? This is probably the person to ask. And his goal that he stated is to have 100 million learners on the EDX platform by 2022. How's that going to happen? What does that even mean? Please join us next week for a very, very important and exciting session. Now, also for next week, if you have any more requests for our book club, please fire them my way because we're getting ready to launch the next poll. The topic is going to be nonfiction for the future of education. And if you'd like to get access to any of the books that we've discussed on the book club or that we discussed here today, go to the bookstore, brianalexander.org/bookstore, and you can find the only curated list of books for the future of education. Now, if you want to keep this conversation going, if you want to keep talking about where education and technology are headed, if you want to talk about net neutrality, MOOCs, or anything else, we're all over social media. So you should know that you can find me, Brian Alexander on Twitter. You can, of course, find the hashtag FEDE. We have discussion groups on Slack, LinkedIn, and Facebook for talking about this, where conversation is happening right now. If you want to find more about Shindig, you can see their links there. Let me thank you all so much for participating in a very, very important session. See you online, and we'll see you next week. Bye-bye.